the infirmity of his physical powers. The handsome youth of 20 years since, with the flashing eyes and the soft complexion, had grown into a sallow, tired-looking man, whose body, in its stoop and loose fleshiness, betrayed the sedentary labourer, and whose head was quite bald on the top. Unkind critics, who had once compared Albert to an operatic tenor, might have remarked that there was something of the butler about him now. Beside Victoria he presented a painful contrast. She too was stout, but it was with the plumpness of a vigorous matron, and an eager vitality was everywhere visible, in her energetic bearing, her protruding inquiring glances, her small, fat, capable and commanding hands. If only by some sympathetic magic she could have conveyed into that portly, flabby figure, that desiccated and discouraged brain, a measure of the stamina and the self-assurance that were so preeminently hers. But suddenly she was reminded that there were other perils besides those of ill health. During a visit to Coburg in 1860, the Prince was very nearly killed in a carriage accident. He escaped with a few cuts and bruises, but Victoria's alarm was extreme, though she concealed it. "It is when the Queen feels most deeply," she wrote afterwards, "that she always appears calmest, and she could not and dared not allow herself to speak of what might have been, or even to admit to herself, and she cannot and dare not now, the entire danger, for her head would turn." Her agitation, in fact, was only surpassed by her thankfulness to God. She felt, she said, that she could not rest without doing something to mark permanently her feelings, and she decided that she would endow a charity in Coburg. £1,000 or even £2,000, given either at once or in instalments yearly, would not, in the Queen's opinion, be too much. Eventually, the smaller sum having been fixed upon, it was invested in a trust called the Victoria Stift, in the name of the Burgomaster and chief clergyman of Coburg, who were directed to distribute the interest yearly among a certain number of young men and women of exemplary character belonging to the humbler ranks of life. Shortly afterwards the Queen underwent, for the first time in her life, the actual experience of close personal loss. Early in 1861 the Duchess of Kent was taken seriously ill, and in March she died. The event overwhelmed Victoria. With a morbid intensity she filled her diary for pages with minute descriptions of her mother's last hours, her dissolution and her corpse, interspersed with vehement apostrophes and the agitated outpourings of emotional reflection. In the grief of the present, the disagreements of the past were totally forgotten. It was the horror and the mystery of death, death present and actual, that seized upon the imagination of the Queen. Her whole being, so instinct with vitality, recoiled in agony from the grim spectacle of the triumph of that awful power. Her own mother, with whom she had lived so closely and so long that she had become a part almost of her existence, had fallen into nothingness before her very eyes. She tried to forget, but she could not. Her lamentations continued with a strange abundance, a strange persistency. It was almost as if, by some mysterious and unconscious precognition, she realised that for her, in an especial manner, that grisly Majesty had a dreadful dart in store. For indeed, before the year was out, a far more terrible blow was to fall upon her. Albert, who had for long been suffering from sleeplessness, went on a cold and drenching day towards the end of November to inspect the buildings for the new military academy at Sandhurst. On his return it was clear that the fatigue and exposure to which he had been subjected had seriously affected his health. He was attacked by rheumatism, his sleeplessness continued, and he complained that he felt thoroughly unwell. 3 days later a painful duty obliged him to visit Cambridge. The Prince of Wales, who had been placed at that university in the previous year, was behaving in such a manner that a parental visit and a parental admonition had become necessary. The disappointed father, suffering in mind and body, carried through his task, but on his return journey to Windsor he caught a fatal chill. During the next week he gradually grew weaker and more miserable. Yet, depressed and enfeebled as he was, he continued to work. It so happened that at that very moment a grave diplomatic crisis had arisen. Civil war had broken out in America, and it seemed as if England, owing to a violent quarrel with the Northern States, was upon the point of being drawn into the conflict. A severe despatch by Lord John Russell was submitted to the Queen, and the Prince perceived that, if it was sent off unaltered, war would be the almost inevitable consequence. At 7 o'clock on the morning of December 1st he rose from his bed, and with a quavering hand wrote a series of suggestions for the alteration of the draft by which its language might be softened and a way left open for a peaceful solution of the question. These changes were accepted by the Government, and war was averted. It was the Prince's last memorandum. He had always declared that he viewed the prospect of death with equanimity. "I do not cling to life," he had once said to Victoria. "You do, but I set no store by it." And then he had added, "I am sure if I had a severe illness I should give up at once. I should not struggle for life. I have no tenacity of life." He had judged correctly. Before he had been ill many days, he told a friend that he was convinced he would not recover. He sank and sank. Nevertheless, if his case had been properly understood and skilfully treated from the first, he might conceivably have been saved; but the doctors failed to diagnose his symptoms, and it is noteworthy that his principal physician was Sir James Clark. When it was suggested that other advice should be taken, Sir James pooh-poohed the idea. There was no cause for alarm, he said. But the strange illness grew worse. At last, after a letter of fierce remonstrance from Palmerston, Dr. Watson was sent for, and Dr. Watson saw at once that he had come too late. The Prince was in the grip of typhoid fever. "I think that everything so far is satisfactory," said Sir James Clark. Note: Clarendon, Volume 2, pages 253-4. Quote, "One cannot speak with certainty, but it is horrible to think that such a life may have been sacrificed to Sir J. Clark's selfish jealousy of every member of his profession." Close quote. The Earl of Clarendon to the Duchess of Manchester, December 17th, 1861. End of note. The restlessness and the acute suffering of the earlier days gave place to a settled torpor and an ever-deepening gloom. Once the failing patient asked for music, "a fine chorale at a distance," and a piano having been placed in the adjoining room, Princess Alice played on it some of Luther's hymns, after which the Prince repeated "The Rock of Ages." Sometimes his mind wandered. Sometimes the distant past came rushing upon him. He heard the birds in the early morning, and was at Rosenau again, a boy. Or Victoria would come and read to him Peveril of the Peak, and he showed that he could follow the story, and then she would bend over him, and he would murmur "Liebes Frauchen" and "Gutes Weibchen," stroking her cheek. Her distress and her agitation were great, but she was not seriously frightened. Buoyed up by her own abundant energies, she would not believe that Albert's might prove unequal to the strain. She refused to face such a hideous possibility. She declined to see Dr. Watson. Why should she? Had not Sir James Clark assured her that all would be well? Only 2 days before the end, which was seen now to be almost inevitable by everyone about her, she wrote, full of apparent confidence, to the King of the Belgians. "I do not sit up with him at night," she said, "as I could be of no use, and there is nothing to cause alarm." The Princess Alice tried to tell her the truth, but her hopefulness would not be daunted. On the morning of December 14th, Albert, just as she had expected, seemed to be better. Perhaps the crisis was over. But in the course of the day there was a serious relapse. Then at last she allowed herself to see that she was standing on the edge of an appalling gulf. The whole family was summoned, and one after another the children took a silent farewell of their father. "It was a terrible moment," Victoria wrote in her diary.